Hey everyone, Pastor Ryan here, and I want to talk to you about rest because we have a problem with rest. We don't do it well, or for some of us, we don't do it at all. In our culture, we wear like a badge of honor the fact that we work harder or longer, or we fill our time with more things, with more stuff, with more experiences than anybody else. And I would have said that we have a problem with rest before we found ourselves in a present moment like now, when we are under stay-at-home orders and non-essential workers are needing to work from home, and we've suddenly lost the flow of time altogether. With all of this time at home or staying in place, we still can't find our way from out in front of that screen, or with all of the busy work we try to put in the box of time that we have. More than that, this pandemic has opened us up to stories about our achievement and success and worth that are damaging. But what if I told you that there is an ancient invitation given to us by our God, implanted in our very bones, that invites us to live a different way, that invites us to come and see that there is a holiness to ceasing, to being, to resting. This practice is called the Sabbath, and so Pastor Noah, Pastor Kristen, and I want to invite you into the conversation of Sabbath. And in the next series of videos, where we're also going to have some special guests join us, we're going to talk about what is Sabbath, what are its ins and outs, what is the invitation being given to us by God, and how can we carry that forward into our lives, wherever we are and whatever the future holds. We want to invite you to join us in accepting this divine invitation. Enjoy.
Shalom, greetings to you. My name is Travis West. I'm a professor of Hebrew and Old Testament at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan. And I'm so excited to have been invited to participate in this conversation about the Sabbath and how Sabbath intersects with this really unique moment in our time as not only a church, but as a world, as we face the pandemic of COVID-19 together. For this video, what is the Sabbath? What does the Bible teach about the Sabbath? Well, it all starts for Scripture in the opening creation account. The Sabbath portion comes the first 3 verses of Genesis chapter 2, when God has finished the work of creation and then ceases from that work. And the verb used, shavat, in Hebrew, which is where we get the word Sabbath from, the verb shavat means to cease. And it further kind of means to rest. And later on in the biblical story, it takes on the added meaning of celebrate. But this idea of ceasing, to cease, is kind of at the root of what this word means. And it's at the root of what God does at the beginning of the seventh day. But it's somewhat paradoxical in that on the seventh day, God ceases from God's work in creation. And of course, God's work in creation was the act of creating. But as the rabbis point out, by ceasing from work, God creates rest, which is referred to with the phrase in Hebrew, or the word in Hebrew, menuha, rest, which has a kind of eschatological bent, is sort of anticipation of the end of time, which is that at the end of time we will return to a place of pure rest with God. And so the Sabbath each week is kind of then an anticipation of this rest with God at the end of time. But there at the beginning, God models rest for us, but also, and very importantly, God builds within the fabric of creation, within the very nature of time. God enfolds this pattern of rest every 7 days. Then Israel later on is commanded to practice rest with God, but it's rooted in this creation account. And so it's thus intrinsic to the very fabric or the pattern of creation to rest. And it's a part of God's vision for not only human creation, but the what we might call inanimate parts of creation as well, to practice this rest. I want to just tease out a couple of things that I find really, really important in this initial creation account. The first, as I've mentioned already, is that rest is an intrinsic part of the created world. It's a part of God's primary vision for how creation will flourish. Because it is the climax of creation. It's not the creation of humankind at the end of day 6. It's that the whole creation account culminates in the creation of Sabbath on the 7th day. The second thing is that the Sabbath, the day of the Sabbath, is the first element of all of creation that God makes holy. And this is a really important word, Kadosh Holy. It is the first part of creation that is made holy. And it is also likewise blessed by God. And this idea of God making something holy and blessing is, from a biblical perspective, what God is doing is God is pouring out God's life-giving power into that aspect of creation, which for us kind of modern 21st century types, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because for us, time is just like an unending sequence of moments. It's just the tick-tock of the clock, and it just keeps spinning around from 12 back to 12 back to 12. But for the people of Israel, that was not true. Time was not all created equal. Some times were filled with God's life-giving power in a way that other times weren't. Or in this case, some days, like the 7th day, the Sabbath day, Shabbat, or for us, Saturday, was filled with God's life-giving power. And thus, it was a day that when you celebrated it, you had access to that life-giving power of God in a way that wasn't always accessible on the other days. But again, for us, this doesn't make any sense, because not only is time just the spinning of the clock, time is primarily a line, right? And all time is basically equal. And but again, for the people of Israel, this idea of linear time as a line, was not what the people of Israel imagined when they thought about time. For the people of Israel, and this is very rooted in their vision of the Sabbath and the role that it plays in their like philosophy, I guess you might say. For the people of Israel, time was more like a flower. It was a much more dynamic image, and not just any flower. Think of like a black-eyed Susan or a daisy or something like that, where you have a center and then all of these overlapping petals that flow out from the center and back to it, right? And they're all overlapping and they loop all the way around. That is a much more accurate picture for what time looked like and how time was experienced for the people of Israel. And so the Sabbath is like that center that's connected to the stem that connects to the roots, that is the life source of the flower. And the petals are like each week, let's say, time flows out from that center, and every week on the Sabbath it returns to the center, to its life source, to its the centering dynamic for it that animates its life, that orients its life, and that allows it to remain connected to all of the other petals, but also to the earth and the air and the sun and the whole cycle and value of its life. The beauty of itself as a flower is intrinsic to its connectedness in that way around the center. And so time is more like a flower than a line for the people of Israel. And their practice of ceasing is what brings them from that outer edge of the loop back to the center. So every week they cease from the work that characterizes their week. And we are invited to do the same. So if you can imagine work, how does work in our lives? That's one of the questions that the Sabbath prompts for us. And you can think of work as obviously your job, the things that you do at your job, but also the larger kind of cultural value that is placed on work and jobs. And so you can think about achievement and productivity and efficiency and the sense of busyness, right? These are all things associated with our work life, our careers, our jobs, that are ways that we negotiate socially and culturally that speak value into our lives, that affirm that our lives have value. Or if you are unable to remain busy, if you don't have a job, if you don't feel productive, if you don't achieve in the way that culture and society defines as valuable, then the opposite is true. You don't have value, you don't have worth, you aren't contributing, and thus you are perhaps expendable or forgettable or ignorable. And so you can see already some of the dangers of this. And these are all rooted in a linear view of time. That it's the linear view of time that comes with this value system of achievement, productivity, busyness as the external factors of value and worth, and ultimately what constitutes our identity in our culture and society. But it's into this whole system that the Sabbath says, stop, cease from work, so that at least once a week you can return to this center where the biblical message of your value can be heard again, where the noise of work and culture and all of its value system can be silenced. And you can hear the still small voice of God saying, "You are my beloved son or daughter. You are my beloved child, and in you I am well pleased." That is the message of the gospel. But that message is complicated and distorted through our work culture in our life in the 21st century United States of America. And so the Sabbath is this prohibition, or it's a protest. That's what I'm looking for. It's a protest against this larger work culture that defines value externally, and it's then a ceasing from that so that you can return to the center, to your center as a beloved child of God, and remember that your value is intrinsic to your existence. Your value was given to you by the fact that you're created by the creator of the universe. Not because you are someone who works and produces things over the course of a week. And so this return to the center is like an active protest against these extrinsic values that define our identities. And then it's an invitation to accept and receive the intrinsic value that we carry as members of God's community, as being created in God's image. But it's also beyond us. It's an invitation to remember that all of creation has that intrinsic value as well. And so in a time like this, where climate change and injustice around the world is rampant, the Sabbath is a word that speaks not only to our own individual existence, but to the global community and to the created world itself, identifying and affirming its value and our interconnectedness, right? This is rooting us back in the creation account, where all the various aspects of creation were interdependent, and their value and their goodness was in part, at least, related to the connectedness between each element. But I love this image of the flower, right, returning to the center. And Abraham Joshua Heschel describes the Sabbath in his phenomenal book, which is called The Sabbath. He talks about the Sabbath as a palace in time. And elsewhere he calls it a cathedral in time. And I actually like that language better, the cathedral in time, because what do you do in a cathedral? You come to the cathedral to worship. You come to the cathedral to dwell in the presence of God, in the presence of others, which of course is we can't do right now during COVID-19 stay at home. But again, we will be able to do so again. And so the Sabbath is this experience that helps us remain connected to each other, but it also helps us come into this place of worship, to dwell in God's presence, because God dwells in the center. God dwells in the center of the flower, in the center of time. And the Sabbath is the doorway for us into that space. But the Sabbath is not just about ceasing from the external voices of culture and society that define our value. It's also about ceasing from the internal voices that try to define our existence. And this is actually recent learning for me that I've learned from my wife, who is an incredibly wise person. And she has helped me to realize that the Sabbath is an invitation to cease from the internal narrative that tries to define us according to a value system that is at odds with God's value system. So it's an invitation to cease from the story of I'm not good enough. It's an invitation to cease from the story that I'm not worthy of love, that I'm not smart enough, that I will never succeed like that person does, or that I don't belong, or that I'm a failure, or that I'm fill in the blank. The Sabbath is a ceasing not only of the external story, but also the internal one that limits us, that prevents us from being our full self in the world. So I hope that this video has helped kind of reframe your idea of what the Sabbath is, that maybe it's bigger and more life-giving than simply choosing not to mow your lawn on Sundays. But that there is a deep well of meaning here, and that it's this incredible invitation, this gift from God, which is what Jesus calls it in the New Testament. It's a gift. It's not a master. It doesn't want to enslave you. It wants to free you and liberate you to be your full self in the world. And the idea is that as we practice this on one day of the week, we start living into it every day of the week. So the Sabbath is more like the practice ground for the rest of the week, where we truly live out these values in our work spaces and in our families and in creation. So I hope the next couple of videos will be helpful for you in putting some flesh on some of these more abstract ideas that I'm trying to express from the Bible. But thanks for listening. And shalom.